EFF leader Julius Malema has reignited controversy with incendiary comments advocating violence as a necessary means of revolution in South Africa. In a recent speech, Malema declared that dismantling systemic inequality and colonial legacies would require violence, directly challenging beliefs in peaceful resolutions to the country's racial and economic disparities.
The EFF exists in a country indoctrinated to believe that the contradictions between the African black majority and the white capitalist ruling class can be resolved peacefully, and that violence in any form must be avoided and condemned. This belief is simply untrue. We must explain this truth to our people. When the South African Human Rights Commission takes us to court for saying that ultimately our revolution will require us to kill, we must be prepared to contextualize what we mean. When the Human Rights Commission and the racist lobby group take us to court for declaring that we are in a war with white supremacy, we must be able to explain to our people what black consciousness is and why it cannot coexist with the idea that white people are inherently superior and one of the two must die. Fanon is important here because he gives us the tools to explain to our people that the conditions within which they live are violent. It is violence to segregate African people into underdeveloped townships and villages without services. It is violence for a white minority to have complete control over the means of production in Africa. It is violence that the majority of the land remains in the hands of a white minority. Colonialism is institutional and structural violence, and reversing it requires violence.
Malema argued that South Africa's history of institutional oppression constitutes a form of structural violence against black South Africans. The revolution will require us to kill, he stated, adding that black consciousness cannot coexist with the notion of white superiority. He framed land ownership disparities and economic control by the white minority as forms of ongoing colonial violence, asserting that reversing these injustices demands radical action. "We are at a war with white supremacy," Malema said, drawing on the works of revolutionary thinker Frantz Fanon to justify his call for violence. He also criticized the South African Human Rights Commission, SHRC, and other organizations for opposing his rhetoric, claiming their actions reflect systemic bias. Malema has faced significant backlash over his statements, which critics have described as incitement to racial violence. Organizations such as the SHRC have previously taken him to court for hate speech, including his controversial singing of "Kill the Boer," a song many interpret as promoting violence against white farmers. In response to Malema's remarks, South African political analysts have expressed concerns about escalating racial tensions in the country. Legal and human rights groups warn that such rhetoric undermines efforts at national reconciliation and could spark further social unrest. Malema remains unapologetic, insisting that his message reflects the frustration of South Africa's black majority, who continue to live in poverty under conditions shaped by apartheid-era inequalities. His comments highlight a growing divide in South African politics over land reform, racial justice, and the future of the country's fragile democracy.